we're going to be talking tonight about is supporting students who have extensive or intensive intervention needs, particularly around behavior. And in having this conversation, we're going to be grounding it within our comprehensive integrated three-tiered model of prevention. So, of course, our Ci3T triangle is our nice visual metaphor to show how we have things that we're doing for all students at Tier 1 to support academic skills, behavioral health, and social and emotional well-being. These are just the critical components of our school environment and the things that we're doing to be proactive to make sure students' needs are met. But we know in education, there is no one size fits all. And so the beauty of a three-tiered model of prevention like Ci3T is that we have a plan to support students who might need just a little bit of extra support at that Tier 2 level. But sometimes even good interventions don't really work for everybody. Sometimes the needs are just higher or greater for a certain student or a certain time period. And we need to go to interventions that are even more intensive to support students that have those really major concerns, because we want to help to make sure that we can prevent those concerns from causing greater harm as that student goes on through their development, and just to really try to help them find as much success at school as we possibly can. So what we need are really effective Tier 3 interventions, and that's what we're going to be covering here tonight. As we're thinking about some of the resources and ideas that we're sharing out, we would love for you to engage with us in any way that you're comfortable with. So you might have questions after you walk away tonight, and you're always welcome to reach out to us via email. Stacy does a great job passing questions or comments on to the presenters or other folks that are here to support through coaching conversations. So if you ever want to reach out to us, you certainly are welcome to do so. And we're also available on social media, and we've got presence on Instagram and Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. You can find our social media accounts. And we're trying to be active there to kind of engage the educational sphere as a whole. And particularly as we're thinking about some of the resources that we're going to be talking about tonight, we do want to tell you, and I'll give you some more information on this in a few minutes, some of the things we're going to be sharing tonight are part of a research project. And so at this time, we would ask you to not share any of the resources that we're going to be looking at tonight with other folks outside your school or district. However, in the long run, some of these materials are going to become free to access for people across the country as early as this coming summer. So we're hoping that you will follow our social media accounts so that you can stay apprised of when those materials are shared out with the world and can engage in dialogue with other people, having the same conversations and using the same resources that we're going to be looking at tonight. But as I mentioned, right now, a lot of this is kind of super top secret stuff that you get to be the first people to look at, kind of early adopters. So that's a cool thing to celebrate. But we do ask that these resources stay kind of close to the chest for the time being. So throughout the night, we're going to be connecting you with what we're calling enhancing Ci3T professional learning resources. We'll give you this information a few times, but the short of it is you can access these professional learning resources and modules via our website, which is ci3t.org/enhance. When you try to go to that webpage, you'll find that it's password protected. And as I mentioned, that's because some of these resources are being protected as part of a randomized control trial that's ongoing in a few states. And so they're not quite ready to be shared out with the public as a whole, but because you guys are our research partners, or one of our research partners, you do have access to this. And anyone that works in your school or your district also has access at this time, especially for our folks in Kansas. If you're outside of Kansas, you might need to contain your sharing of resources to people within inside your own school. But we're going to show you how to use this page here a little bit tonight so that you can access different resources that are related to the content that we're going to be talking about, which are Tier 3 interventions. So the structure of the night is going to be to do a quick overview of the Ci3T model and some of the data that you might look at to figure out which students have Tier 3 needs. David's going to lead that conversation and then jump into our next section, which is talking about students that have acting out behaviors or externalizing behaviors, and looking at a specific intervention approach that's called individualized de-escalation plans. It's a really, really helpful piece of information for educators that are working with students that have major acting out behaviors, which is a huge issue facing a lot of public school faculty and staff. In fact, in a survey that we did a couple of years ago, that was the number one thing that people said they needed help with was how to support students to have those major acting out behaviors. So David's going to run us through that content, and then we'll come back to me and we're going to do another section on how to support students that have pretty significant mental health or internalizing behavioral needs, which are our students that are shy or anxious or withdrawn. And as just a quick little spoiler, these two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So as you're thinking about students that you work with, you might actually find that content across both those big sections, the externalizing section and the internalizing section, might even pertain to the same student. So hopefully we're going to cover a lot of useful ground for you as you're thinking about what all this information means in terms of supporting those students. And then we'll do a quick wrap up at the end. So you all are not alone in your Ci3T work. Schools across the country are implementing Ci3T and are really eager to learn more about how to best implement this model. It's complex work with a lot of moving pieces. And so as part of acknowledging that people might need some additional support to help implement Ci3T effectively, Project Enhance is the current research project that's being conducted to create professional learning resources to assist with this work. So we're in the end stages of Project Enhance. And the big idea basically has been creating these professional learning modules or resources that show you how to implement different interventions or help train leaders to guide this work in your school. And basically right now we have this randomized control trial where we're looking to see whether schools who have these resources are able to shift student outcomes and find better teacher efficacy by way of having basically more robust professional learning. And so as you're getting a preview tonight of some of those resources, we hope that you find these very useful in your work and kind of use them as a guidepost for what you might do in terms of supporting your students in terms of behavior. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Royer for our first sections. Thanks, David.
Quick, brief overview of the Ci3T model, because the assumption is you're pretty familiar with the triangle by now. You've seen it before, maybe a couple times. So as you know, with Ci3T, we've got the expanded form of MTSS. So beyond just academic and behavior to include the social skills curriculum. And with this model, all adults in the building, everybody can take part at tier one, including our custodial staff, our cafeteria staff, bus drivers, because everyone can be reinforcing the behaviors that we want to see happen more often using behavior-specific praise paired with tickets, and that way we're shaping those behaviors. And then we have an implementation manual that outlines the roles and responsibilities for everybody involved. So not just faculty and staff, but the students, parents and community, the administrators, everybody's clear, transparent, Kathleen calls it the blueprint, so we all know what's going on, what's expected of us as individuals, and what the whole plan entails. So that includes not just what is the reading curriculum that we're using 90 minutes a day uninterrupted at elementary, and what's the math named curriculum and how many minutes, but also how do we implement all of the curricula that we do using the low intensity strategies, for example. And you hear us talk about those quite a bit, and using the enhanced modules. There's a module for each of these that you can go more in depth on and learn about them and share different components with your colleagues. If you find little tidbits or nuggets or infographics that you'd like to share with them, or send them the link to the whole module. So that's included in the plan, what we want to see when we do our walkthroughs throughout the building. Similarly, with the middle column there for behavior, we've got our school-wide expectation matrix, and everybody's responsible for teaching that and reinforcing those behaviors when we see them occurring with our students. But we know that sometimes there will be misbehavior. And so we've got a reactive plan to follow as well. And we're going to look at some of that as part of the module today for the acting out cycle, making sure that we're showing empathy first and redirecting students, but keeping the flow of instruction going while we praise those students who are on task and meeting expectations. And with the social skills curriculum, and there's our picture of the reactive plan in one of our templates and models, exemplars. And then with social skills, we outline what is the name of the curriculum that we're using and the dosage, and maybe it's different at different grade levels. Each manufacturer, each publisher will have a different recommended dosage or some options that you choose from. And so you've outlined that in your plan as well and follow the guidelines there that the CI3D leadership team, working with the full faculty and staff, has decided. So we're very clear on what those roles and responsibilities are, but also how do we teach it to everybody? How do we roll out the plan to not only these faculty and staff who are expected to put it in place, but how do we roll it out to students so they know what's expected of them? How do we reinforce not only students for meeting expectations, but how do we reinforce the adults? Sometimes we forget to do that. How do we reinforce those who are putting the plan in place with integrity and really meeting all of those roles and responsibilities and doing the monitoring and everything else? Because we've got a plan for that as well. At the school-wide level, how do we know if everything that we've planned is working? Within the classrooms, we also promote the integrated lesson plan, and that's where we can think not only about our academic objective, but what do we need to know for our behavioral objectives and our social skills objectives? What have we taught recently with those social skills curricula? Maybe a while ago, we're going to revisit it. So maybe I'm going to do some pre-correction, and that's just one of those 7 low-intensity strategies that I'm going to now be thinking very intentionally as I'm designing this integrated lesson plan. Where can I use these? Where's a good place for some instructional choice? Where are some good places for pre-correction? And how can I script some of my opportunities to respond throughout to keep that high engagement all the time? And then where's am I going to use my active supervision as they start working independently, as I do that graduated release of I do, we do, you do, for example. And not that every single lesson a teacher's going to use has this filled out, complete integrated lesson plan, but you do a couple, you get started, you get the idea. And so that as you're heading into every lesson, you're thinking about what are the behavioral skills my students need? Can I remind them of to use? For social skills, what do they need to do? How do I pre-correct for those? So for math with those individual whiteboards, like who can remind me of what the expectations are? And yes, we just use it to write our problems on. Who can remind us of a non-example for using whiteboards? Oh, that's right. We don't use them as frisbees across the room. That's right. We don't use it to hit people in the head with, and all the things that we do use, and that can prevent a lot of the challenging behavior. With all that in place at the school-wide level, we look at social validity twice a year, fall and spring, see what people are thinking of the plan so we can make adjustments every summer to have an updated plan as needed the next year. And we also look at treatment integrity. How's the whole plan being implemented? So fall and spring, we send out the teacher self-report, and for the social validity, the primary intervention rating scale. And then we always want to share that back with everybody in the implementation report so they know what they spent their time completing as a survey and what were the results. That can be very inspiring and motivating to celebrate successes, as well as to see if there's a little place where we can focus on and double down on our efforts with tier 1 in this one element or whatever might be needed. And then, of course, with systematic screening 3 times a year for both academics and behavior, we use a lot of those data to connect our students to supports, such as the tier 3 supports that we're going to be reviewing here tonight. So if I were to look at some example data, here's an elementary school's externalizing results, just looking at winter compared to winter every year, because we want to compare the same time points each year. And you can see that this school implementing Ci3T is not meeting that ideal 80% in the low risk, and that's okay. They're working on that and there's steady improvement, and then life happens, there's fluctuations, but we keep going and we keep looking at, okay, how's our treatment integrity? What have we done to teach not only the screening procedures, but all of the behavioral expectations and give us students opportunities to practice, all the things that would influence these behavior screening results. We do the same thing with academics and what percentage of students are at grade level or proficient and which are a year or two below. And then we can make some decisions to connect students to supports based on looking at multiple sources of data. Academic screening, behavior screening, attendance is always a big concern to look at when we're connecting students. Looking at internalizing as well. Mark's going to cover the internalizing interventions. And we would start here with these data to see which students are at moderate or high risk for internalizing, and then see if they've got any supports already in place or what can we connect them to, how's their attendance, how's their nurse visits, all the other sources of data as well. So doing all that at tier 1, we know that's not going to work for all students. Many students will need more. Some will need tier two supports. We aim for 10 to 15% when we have a strong tier one in place with Fidelity, and we hope to meet students' needs there. And that's not going to work for all of them as well. We know 1 to 5% are probably going to also need more individualized, more intensive tier three supports. And that doesn't have to be one-on-one. That could just be increased dosage. One of my favorite classes to teach as a high school resource teacher for 8 years was our intensive reading clinic. And it was small groups. I had 10 students in the room, and I worked with a group of five, and my paraeducator worked with a group of five. And we had them for 100 minutes a day. So it was a double block. And that's what made it a tier three intervention with that intensive dosage to catch them up in their reading very quickly. As we're covering our materials tonight, you may be thinking, what can we add to our Ci3T tiered library at our school? Or if you don't have one, you might consider building one or having a landing page with links to all the resources like the Ci3T Enhance page so that you're building an electronic library. It used to be we'd have little kits where you could come get your OTR physical bucket with all the things you would need for response cards and communication cups and carry that to your classroom. But now with digital, you just help your faculty and staff figure out ways to build their library and connect them to all these supports. You could be presenting these to your faculty and staff as well during maybe 10 minutes of a faculty and staff meeting just to introduce them to the topic and then make the connection to the resources where they can learn more, read more in depth, push play on the interactive resources, which will show you. Look at the infographics, of course, little short videos, just email one piece at a time or followed by the link to the full module if they get hooked and want to learn more. So with that overview of Ci3T, we're going to focus tonight, as Mark said, on tier three. And you don't need a lot of tier three interventions. We just need a handful that we know work because these do take a lot more time and resources, energy, effort, and we can't spread ourselves too thin by having too many options. So we're going to use the ones that we know work. And tonight we're going to start with looking at managing the acting out cycle. So in the lower right corner there, you see the cover card for this module. And on the Enhance page, if you scroll down, you'll see a section for implementing tertiary or tier three interventions. And it's the first one there if you want to click and follow along or look at any of these resources. But you'll see that lovely child there with a little bit of anger issues going on maybe. And that'll be your key that this is for managing that acting out, externalizing behavior patterns. So follow along there or look to get any resources. And I know my colleagues have wonderfully and graciously dropped the password in the chat for everyone. If, as you're sharing these modules with your faculty and staff, people may need some support depending on their comfort level with technology, they may need some support navigating the modules. So when you first get to that ci3t.org Enhance page, near the top, right underneath the graphic, there's a link to this infographic that will help people know how to navigate the module. So once you click into this managing acting out behavior at tier three, you'll see that there's the sidebar on the left that's got our chapters for this ebook. And so you can jump around there. You can also navigate with these left and right arrows that appear on each page to take you to the next page or the previous page. There's some accessibility items at the top to enlarge the text or change the color background. And this links to the interactive resource, as does the cover page, that'll take you to the same content, but presented in a more sit back, push play, and listen format with some animations and other things happening more like, as Kathleen says, a tricked out PowerPoint. So it's a more interactive resource module that we'll call it rather than these versions where you read the pages and there's some interactions built into each of the pages. As with all modules, you'll see in this one that there's a tier three intervention grid. This will allow you to copy it and put it into your implementation manual for the section on the tier three intervention grid. And then you can customize it if you need to adjust any of the cut scores, like maybe increasing the number of office discipline referrals or lowering the number of office discipline referrals so that you can get the right students connected to these supports based on your population and your behavior data and everything else that you have going on. So to introduce the acting out cycle, it's all based on the science of behavior. And we're going to look at the three-term contingency. So we've got antecedents, behavior, and consequences. You might have heard some teachers, you might have said it yourself, say, that behavior came out of nowhere. And that's the B in the ABCs of behavior. And because we're so focused very often on teaching the academic lesson that we've worked really hard and to get really creative with, we're not always noticing some of the warning signs that we're going to look at in this acting out cycle. We may miss the triggers, we may miss the signs of agitation or even acceleration, and then suddenly we're at peak behavior with the big B behavior. Whereas if we can take some time to understand the cycle, we might be better at recognizing the antecedents, the A's. What happens before the behavior? What are the triggers that can warn us that something's happening? What are the agitation signs? Because we might be able to make some adjustments and prevent the student from getting to that peak behavior. We also really want to know what is the function of the behavior. Once we can identify what the behavior is and hopefully what the antecedents are, if we think about the function, why the behavior is occurring, because all behaviors happen for a couple reasons, either to get something or to avoid something. There's always a communicative intent of the behavior. They're the person who's engaging in this disruptive acting out behavior, they're trying to say something, get something, avoid something. And if we can figure that out and help, we can empathize, we can redirect, and we can prevent any future occurrences of that peak behavior. Then there's the consequences. We don't want to accidentally reinforce the challenging behavior by providing something after that would signal to the student, oh, this is what I need to keep doing in order to get what I want. So, for example, if I'm embarrassed at the reading that I have to do in front of a small group of students and I act out and I get sent out, maybe sent to the office, that consequence that occurred after my acting out during the small group reading, being sent to the office was what I wanted. I got to escape and avoid the reading activity that I was embarrassed by. So what's going to happen the next time I'm in a reading group and I feel embarrassed? I've learned that if I act out, I'll probably get sent out to the office again and I can avoid that activity. So we're going to look at some strategies to not accidentally reinforce behaviors like that and figure out what other things can we do after behavior that could replace the behavior or reinforce the good pro-social behaviors that we do want to see happen more often. And sometimes it's about pre-correction there. You read on the bottom of the slide. Pre-correction, just reminding the student as we go into this activity, here is what the expectation is. Here is what I want to see. Here is how to appropriately get my attention or the attention of your peers, or what is okay to be collaborating with on and how with your peers. So all this is going to be based on these ABCs of behavior. And it's important that we share all about these acting out the cycles and the stages with our colleagues, all the faculty and staff, because our classrooms are becoming more diverse in so many different wonderful ways that we love to celebrate. Part of that includes maybe not having all the social skills or understandings of what it is that I need to do as a student to be successful in the classroom or out on the playground, because a lot of challenging behavior happens out there, even in the restrooms or the hallways, the cafeteria, all the settings that we have at school. We need to teach, of course, those expectations and practice them and then reinforce them, but help our students who need to know more what they are and practice, and just be aware that there is this diversity of students, including more students with disabilities being in our classrooms, being included. And we need to empower all of our teachers with the skills and strategies to support all students so they don't feel embarrassed or lacking in self-efficacy to where they feel they need to send the student out versus saying, oh, I know what to do here. I understand the student. I know what's happening, and I've got the skills and strategies to support them in the classroom where they can continue learning. We know that 12% of students have a mild form of emotional behavioral disorder, up to 20% have, sorry, that was moderate. 12% have moderate, but up to 20% have mild. And many times those students are not receiving special education services. They're in our general education classroom. So we need to empower our teachers with skills and strategies and understanding, such as the acting out cycle, so they know what to do to interrupt the acting out cycle, keep the students in the calm phase, which we'll get to, and keep the learning going for all students in the classroom. One important thing, and if you maybe don't take anything else away from this presentation on the acting out cycle tonight, important thing to remember is how you first respond when you notice a student is engaging in acting out behavior, challenging behavior, whether it's at the trigger, agitation, acceleration stage. When you first notice, how you first respond is going to set the stage and determine whether this escalates or is going to de-escalate and return the student to calm or to the recovery stage. So showing empathy first, right? And we're going to look at the reactive plan for that and not screaming across the classroom to yell at the student because you noticed they were off task or being agitated and not working on what you told them to work on. That's going to make things worse, and we don't need to engage at that level with students. Somebody told me a long time ago, don't remember when and where, but when I was a high school teacher and I was working with 14-year-olds and when I student taught in middle school, even younger in elementary, it's like you don't need to win against a child. You can let them win sometimes. It's okay. And that's hard for teachers. Like we feel we have to be in control and we have to establish and show control. And so to illustrate that, one example was I could tell a student who was off task and hadn't responded to my first instruction, I could walk over to them and say, you've got 30, after a multiple prompts maybe, but the last one would be, you've got 30 seconds to return to your seat. And I walk away. And they're going to mumble and they're going to say things about me as I continue teaching. And instead of like yelling at them and saying, "What did you say?" or "I thought," I can let it go. I don't have to win. Let them save face in front of their peers because maybe it takes them 45 seconds instead of the 30 seconds that I said, but they will return to their seat. But they got to save face in front of their peers. So it was tough lesson learned for me that I don't have to win every time. It's okay. So speaking of those behavior chains that I mentioned earlier, with that ABCs, every consequence to the behavior can become the antecedent to the next instance of the behavior along this chain of behavior. And so if we can recognize these acting out cycles and the stages and recognize what each of our students looks like in each of those stages, then because of that recognition, we can do something about it. We can interrupt that cycle. We can interrupt the behavior chain. And if we can do that, then we can change the whole momentum of that student's behavior. Taking from the metaphor from physics, once an object is in motion, it tends to stay in motion unless it's acted on by an outside force. There's a little physics lessons for you. But if we see our students starting to engage, being triggered, starting to feel agitated, and we do nothing, it's going to keep going. It's going to escalate and get to that peak behavior. But if we can redirect, if we can distract the student, we'll look at strategies in each of the phases. But if I notice that and I can say, hey, maybe, for example, a student said something that triggered another student and it's about to blow up, but I can instead to the student who got triggered and said, hey, could you do me a favor and run this errand? And just distract them and give them a break and remove them from the situation briefly so they can come back and return to the learning. So we're going to look at the 7 stages of the acting out cycle. See here, starting with calm and then trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery. And in the module that's been enhanced for you using the Ci3T enhanced module, of course, phase 1, you see this image. So I'm stumbling on my words there, but this graphic is our new presentation, and feel free to share this with your faculty and staff to show how one might progress through the phases of the acting out behavior cycle. And we want to, of course, not get to peak. Peak is where often people say that behavior came out of nowhere. We want to instead look and see, oh, there's acceleration, agitation, that trigger, and of course, calm. So starting in calm, that's where we want our students to be all the time. That is our best opportunity to work with our students. That's where we're implementing Ci3T. That's where we're teaching all the strategies and doing our instruction for academics, behavior, and social skills. And most importantly, that's where our students are open to learning strategies for dealing with their triggers because they often know what sets them off. It's that student, or hey, teacher, it's when you get this close to me or something. And we have to be aware that as teachers, we're often the trigger. Or when a math worksheet is presented, that's a trigger. So in the calm stage, that's where we can teach students some relaxation strategies. Maybe it's a breathing strategy. Mark will cover some of these with internalizing as well. Things that students can do to prevent the trigger from happening or to return to calm once the trigger does happen. But this is a good place to do those things where our students are following the rules, we're able to reinforce them, we're leaning fully into our universal reinforcement system with tickets and behavior-specific praise, we're implementing Ci3T with integrity and even especially the social skills lessons, as those often affect our students' behavior and the triggers. So that's our time there to teach and reteach everything that we need, especially the skills that the students might need to self-regulate and manage their own behavior. Some pitfalls that hopefully we can avoid is sometimes teachers will say, well, I feel like I'm tiptoeing on eggshells or walking on eggshells around the student because I'm worried that anything I say might set them off or, trigger them. And that's a valid concern. And so we want to help our teachers recognize and be able to identify what are the triggers. So working with the student, working with the family, working with all the adults, maybe some peers to figure out what are the triggers. Because if we can identify them, then we can avoid them and we don't have to feel like we're walking on eggshells. And if we know what they are, then we can prevent them. We can make adjustments to the environment, to what we do. That math worksheet, I can cut it into strips so it's just a piece at a time. And that's not a trigger because it's a smaller amount of work that's put in front of the students. Maybe transitions are triggers and we can't avoid and we can't not have those transitions happen. But I can prevent the challenging behavior by reminding the student that the transition's about to happen, give them a warning or a signal or something. And sometimes that's enough. But maybe something happens. Maybe there are those triggers. And so we do need to recognize them and do all that we can to identify them and figure out what they are. Hopefully, they're school-based triggers so that they're in our control and they are things that we can have that control over and directly work on. But we also need to recognize that many triggers are happening outside of our classroom, at least, like on the playground, on the quad, and at lunchtime, but also at home or on the bus getting to school. And that's where we really need to show empathy and talk to our students and figure out what might be happening, what's going on, and work with the families. How can we prevent these triggers outside of school? And what can we do as school personnel to help you, help your student, and prevent these triggers from happening? And what can I do as an adult in my classroom to prevent them as well? But first, I got to recognize them. And sometimes it could be something like not having breakfast in the morning. And if there is anything I can do to connect the student to the free lunch program at school, or making sure that paperwork gets filled out by the families, or that they just get to school with enough time. Maybe they're already signed up and they've got their PIN to go get their breakfast, but they're getting to school late. So what can we do to get them here early enough so they can partake in something like breakfast if that was a trigger, having that empty stomach? My students tell me so often, oh, my stomach hurts. I was like, well, did you eat lunch? No. Well, maybe that's why your stomach hurts. Let's see what we can do about that. So strategies here when we are looking at the trigger phase is mostly preventing them. So we've got to identify them, prevent them, but then doing that redirection if we can, distracting them. Sometimes it's like, hey, look at this. Sometimes that's enough for some students. Others, it was I had an envelope pre-written out to certain people that were my buddy teachers, and they knew when they got it that they just needed to hang on to the student for a minute. And if they were able to ask them a question like, hey, how's it going? Or it looks like you're a little frustrated or agitated as something happened, just, that few minutes of talk time before sending them back to my classroom could really help. That just a low level redirection where they didn't lose academic time. This is a good place to rely on our low intensity strategies. And those, as I mentioned, all have modules. So sometimes a distraction could be offering them a choice. Do you want to keep working on this here, or do you want to go work on in the library or with the neighbor teacher, some place where you've got set up where occasionally they can do their work independently somewhere else, if that would help. Being sure, of course, to praise them when they are back on task or are using their breathing strategies or other self-regulation strategies. That's always a good thing to do. And maybe you need to do high probability request sequences where they have a quick and easy something to do as a distraction. Like, hey, could you do me a favor? Could you pick that up over there while I go do this? Or, hey, could you turn off the lights? We're about to start a video. And then it's, okay, hey, could you do number one with me here? I'll help you get started. So that kind of redirection and distraction. The pitfalls that we want to avoid here is when we're working with families, make sure that we're doing strengths-based collaborations. So focusing on and at least starting with what are the strengths of the students. And of course, we want to touch on the areas of concern. We want to identify those triggers, but we don't want to just only talk about those. We want to focus on the strengths and how can we leverage the strengths that these students have to help them self-regulate and self-manage their behavior to recover from a trigger that has occurred. And we don't want to blame people. We know that triggers are going to happen, and like I said, maybe it's me as the teacher and I forgot and I gave them that full math worksheet and didn't cut it into strips. But we don't need to toss around blame. We're just gonna move on. And the next time, remember to do the prevention strategy that we had worked out and making sure that we have that plan, which we're going to get to by the end, with a individualized de-escalation plan that can help us recognize for each student what the triggers are and what to do when those triggers occur, or better yet, how to prevent them. Moving on then to stage phase three, agitation. This, I think, is more easily recognizable. It was hard for me to know what all the triggers were and prevent all the triggers because there's so many things happening out on the playground and quad right before they came into my classroom. But I could definitely notice when a student was agitated. And that could be different for every student. If a student is normally not very active, then increases in their behavior is a sign of agitation. If a student is normally very active and moving around and talking a lot and doing a lot, and suddenly they're quiet and a little more withdrawn and subdued, that's a sign of agitation. I will never forget this one student that I had. She would come into the room and, she was very visibly agitated whenever she got agitated. And that was my cue. Okay, let's over here a little privately first, like, hey, it looks like you're a little frustrated. Something happened at lunch. Like, do you want to talk about it with me, or do you want to go to your counselor and talk about it for a few minutes so that we can get started with our reading work? And she'd either really quickly tell me and that would be fine because it was all people outside, or she'd be like, could I just have a few minutes? I was like, sure, go get a drink of water or just hang out here 5 minutes and then let's get to work, deal? Or give her some choices within there. But recognizing those signs of agitation allowed me to show that empathy and help with the shortest amount of time as possible redirect back to the hopefully calm stage, or at least to where she was willing to do some work. So be on the lookout for all the things that you see on the slides here. There's the extra behavior when it's not normally there, or the decrease in behavior when there is a lot. And strategies to deal with that when we notice that. Again, redirection can be helpful, showing empathy first. And there's a whole module on the six-step instructional approach to responding to challenging behavior. So when I see that agitation, I want to follow these 6 steps. And this is a great infographic that you can share with all of your faculty and staff. So again, showing empathy first. I'm going to get down on their level, but a little distance in case they are agitated enough that they want to get physical. They're that angry. I don't want to get punched. So a little distance, but quiet and privately, I could recognize like, hey, looks like something's going on. What do you need right now? Would you like to do that? Offer some choices maybe. Um, and maybe even before I get there to show that empathy directly, I'm maintaining the flow of instruction. Maybe I was right in the middle of giving direct instruction in lecture mode for a brief mini lesson. And I'm quickly going to pivot and say, okay, everybody turn to your partner and talk about this. And that gives me a moment to go show empathy and talk to the individual student whose agitation I've noticed, while all the other students are able to stay engaged with the academic learning. And while I'm walking back to that individual student, step 3 here, I'm going to acknowledge students who are meeting expectations, behavior specific praise. I like how this group is on task, or jump right into the think, pair, share. Whatever I can see to praise as I work toward the student that's agitated, or maybe it's a small group in the back that's off task or something. With that, showing empathy, maybe give some choices for that redirection. Maybe it's a quick repeat of the expectation. Just remember, the expectation is to be calm, cool, and collected, have your book out, and engage in the learning that we're doing. Or remember, your choice is this or this, and I'll be back in a minute to see which one you picked. And then I do need to walk away. Step 5, I need to give them time and space. No student wants that teacher hovering over them, leaning, waiting for them to make their choice or to see if they're going to calm down. That's just going to escalate the behavior even more. So walking away and giving them some time and space. And then as soon as I do notice, step 6, I want to recognize the appropriate behavior. When they have re-engaged with the work, when I maybe see some deep belly breathing as a relaxation strategy that we've practiced, I'm going to give them some praise publicly if that's what they find reinforcing, or maybe privately, quietly, or in a written praise note if that's what's preferred. So I follow those 6 steps. When I notice the challenging behaviors, the sign of agitation, and you can learn more about that in the whole module. that you see there for six-step instructional approach to challenging behavior. Some pitfalls to avoid. When we see that agitation, this is an opportunity if we can remind the student of some self-regulation strategies that we've worked on. Maybe I can redirect them to self-reflect on something. Maybe they've got a checklist, it's like a self-monitoring checklist for what to do when a trigger happens or they're feeling agitated. Maybe they need to learn how to recognize signs of agitation. Is it their heart rate that goes up? Is it their palms that get sweaty or clammy or sometimes cold? What is it for this student that is a sign of agitation? Can they recognize it? And then what do they do about it? What skills have they been taught and have we practiced for them to manage that agitation and get back to the calm phase as soon as possible? It might be hard for that step 6 to recognize when they are back on task because we want to keep going with our lesson, right? But I got to keep an eye out for that student. If I've redirected or given them choices, and then it may take them 30 seconds, 60 seconds, but they make a choice and they pick up the pencil and they start to work. I want to acknowledge that behavior specific praise. If they find that attention reinforcing, it's more likely that they'll engage in that redirection and on task behavior in the future. I've been talking a lot about these stages, so let's take a look at a video to put it all into action. Hopefully this will show you what I mean. And here's a non-example. This is what you would not want to do if you're the teacher and you notice some agitation. So I'm going to now share my screen with sound and video and push play.
Remember, you can use your notes on this math sheet. You'll have 30 minutes, and then I'll collect your work. Any questions? Michael, it's time to get started on your math sheet. Michael, it's time to get started, okay? Otherwise, you're going to run out of time.
I don't care.
Michael, your choice is to do your math sheet now, or you're going to have to do a makeup.
Whatever, I'm not doing it.
So she did a couple good things, but what did you notice? If anybody's feeling brave, wants to jump on their mic or drop it in the chat, what is something that she didn't do or did that she shouldn't have done based on what we've just learned about the agitation stage? She walked away, right? Anything else? Exactly. She physically touched him, and that was not good at this moment. He's agitated. We don't want to do that. So that's have a little space when you're giving the choices. Maybe show empathy first. She didn't do that. Let's see if this time around she does a little bit different, a little bit better. Tone was a little harsh, you're right, at least toward the last one there especially. Let's see how she does now in this example.
You'll have 30 minutes, and then I'll collect your work. Any questions? Michael, it's time for math. Are you doing okay? Listen, why don't you take a minute and I'll be back shortly. Let's get started.
Now in that example, what did you see that was different? What did she do better? She asked if he was okay. Right. Showed empathy, right? Gave him some more space physically, a little extra time, came back and checked on him. So she's putting into practice what we're talking about with those 6 steps, showing empathy first. She monitored the other students. In this case, they were test taking, so just checked in on a little bit. Everybody was on task, and then came back to work with him. And I like how she even picked up the pencil and like pretended to start the first one. and then able to hand it to them. And sometimes just that showing concern is all that it takes for the student to say like, okay, yeah, she's on my side. I can get back to work, a little redirect. Um, Other times that may not work, right? That student may needed to have talked it out a little bit more. Maybe he needed give some choices. Do you need a 5-minute break? Do you want to go talk to your counselor real fast? Do you want to talk to me outside while everybody's taking the test? I'll keep an eye on him from the hall. Who knows? But in that case, that redirect worked just fine. All right. Phase 4, acceleration. So let's say we, for whatever reason, we missed those signs of agitation, or maybe we saw them, we didn't have time to address them, so we ignored them. We kept going with our instruction, thinking, oh, I'll go talk to him in just a minute, just a minute. And then now it's gotten worse. So things are accelerating. And this is where, rather than just being agitated and kind of on their own with their behaviors, now their behavior is teacher engaging. They've become argumentative. They're completely disengaged if they weren't already. And they're starting to provoke everyone around them, but teachers and peers, and just making a much bigger deal of that acting out, externalizing behavior to where it's becoming completely disruptive. Like Michael in that video, some teachers might have just ignored him and said, oh, that's his choice because he wasn't being disruptive to others. And that was just at the agitation phase. But if nobody helped him, if she hadn't helped him, he might have moved into acceleration and started to be disruptive to everybody taking the test. So we want to, as she did, interrupt these chains and the behavior cycles wherever we can interrupt the behavioral momentum. So acceleration, this is very noticeable, obviously. A lot of things could happen, might even start to get into uh, damaging property, verbal abuse, bad words being said, things like that. So we're headed toward just focusing on safety. If we're noticing that they're at that level of acceleration, we may not be able to give them a choice. They may be beyond that at this point. We could try. We may know our student, but you got to know your student to know whether that'll just make it worse or might actually work. So we're going to focus on safety. If we can get rid of whatever it is that's triggering it so it doesn't just keep going, if we can eliminate it, then maybe that will allow us to calm down a little bit. We always want to approach our students in a non-threatening and calm manner. So never yelling at my student. I'm always speaking in a low, calm voice because that will cause them to as well. They're going to match my pitch and calmness. Maybe not immediately at first, but within a couple exchanges, if they see that I'm that safe, trustworthy, calm person who's not trying to escalate, not confronting them maybe as some other people have in their life, who knows, then they're going to match me. You can also set some limits. And if you would like to learn more about limit setting, there's a few links in the module that you can look at for how to do that. And that way you're avoiding the power struggle. So take a look there or go to the crisisprevention.com website, and that'll teach you more about setting limits. So with these strategies and those pitfalls here that we want to avoid, we don't want to get engaged in a back and forth manner. We're not going to try and argue with them. This isn't the time to do that. If anything, I might use the broken record approach. So your task right now is to take out your book and have a seat, or maybe there's a choice, or maybe work's not going to happen. So your task right now is to sit over here and wait for me as I get the student started. And they may try to engage. And I say, your task right now is to sit over here and then I will come help you. So I'm just repeating the same instruction over and over rather than engaging with them, which is going to escalate. And I certainly wouldn't want to talk to them in a sarcastic way or a fake cheery way, because that's most likely just going to irritate them and aggravate them and accelerate even farther, even faster to the peak behavior. So continuing to remain outwardly calm and neutral. Even if inside I'm upset, I'm hurt, whatever it may be, I'm outwardly staying calm. I had that problem as a high school teacher. I got angry and I stayed outwardly calm, but I would flush and I would slowly turn red. And my students would recognize that. So I could acknowledge that, yes, I am angry right now, but you'll notice that I'm talking to you in a very calm way so we can get this taken care of, or, whatever the situation was. So I couldn't hide that I was angry, with that physical response, but I could still remain otherwise outwardly calm and neutral. Let's take a look at Caleb. He's going to first give us our non-example of disruptive behavior, and then rather what the teacher did as our non-example, and then we'll see a better way to respond. So here's Caleb.
Caleb, cool it. Okay, everyone, I need you to get your papers out from yesterday. Those need to be on your desk. Caleb, if you do not have yours out, that will be a 0 for this assignment. Caleb, I am not going to play these games with you today. Pick up the paper or go to the office. Pick it up. Caleb, I don't know what your problem is, but you will not be disruptive in my class. Do you understand what I'm saying?
What y'all looking at?
That's it. To the office. Out.
So maybe you've had a student like that in your classroom. It can be tough to deal with, but put in the chat, if you would, just drop a sentence in the chat. What did you notice about the teacher's behavior that makes this a non-example of what we shouldn't do? And by the way, that teacher is the dean of my College of Education here at University of Louisville, Amy Lingo, doing a great acting job. Standoffish, she was escalating it, right? She immediately started in on him and didn't let it go. It was just like, Caleb, 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 never talked to any other students, checked on them. Yes, exactly. And she missed a great opportunity. He followed her directions one time. He picked up the paper and she ignored that. Let's take a look at an example where she does a better job. Let's see what she does this time.
Okay, everybody. I need you to get out your papers that we were working on yesterday and start on problem number 7. Problem number 7. Caleb, look, you almost were finished with this yesterday. I want you to start here on number 7. You know how to do these problems. It's just like number 6 from yesterday. So can you go ahead and get started? I need you to make a good choice.
Man, I'm not in the mood today.
I can see that you're not in the mood, Caleb, but I really need you to get this assignment finished, okay? Make a good choice. You need to pass this class.
Man, you know Mr. Carson giving me detention for nothing?
I can see that you're upset and with Mr. Carson, and you and I can talk about that detention later, okay? But right now it's important to focus on math and get this problem done. Keisha, nice job. Great choice, Caleb. Nice job.
So a lot better, right? She showed some empathy. She talked to him a little bit privately, one-on-one. I probably would have given a little more physical space and also time. And depending on the student, even from across the room saying, nice choice, that could be agitation. That level of attention or calling the focus back to him as he's getting to work may or may not have been good, but worked for him. In the accordion that Mark showed you in the very beginning on the enhanced page, where all the materials are for tonight, you can see this resources, and it's got some QR codes or links that take you to videos such as these, as well as the IRIS module on addressing challenging behavior that covers the acting out cycle as well. But the videos, and there's a few pages of videos, are great resources, and there's more than what we're showing you here tonight. So very specific examples of different types of behavior that might be leading up to that peak behavior. And so if we miss the acceleration or we're unable to redirect, then we might have the student engage in the peak behavior. And this is what we think of when we think of the most challenging behavior. This is the throwing of desks, flipping of desks, throwing of books, maybe self-injurious behavior, trying to harm other students or be destructive to property, running out of the room, all those forms of physical aggression. And so our focus here is purely on safety. There's no amount of M&Ms at this point or choices that are going to help our students return to calm. So we just need to ourselves remain calm, help our students remain calm, and implement our safety plan, whatever that is at our school. And very often that's going to be a room clear because of that aggressive or destructive behavior that's occurring. If I were to send the student out to the principal's office with a disciplinary referral or have somebody get them, take them out, that might be reinforcing to the behavior. Maybe that's what they want. That's why I have to know the function of the behavior, because I don't want to accidentally reinforce this acting out really aggressive peak behavior by sending them away if that's what they wanted. So instead, we keep the student who's acting out in the classroom and do a room clear so that we don't reinforce that behavior, letting them escape. So they stay in the room, take some time, they calm down. And I've worked out that room clear with a neighbor teacher or a partner so that we can do that efficiently. Some people always ask me, well, what does it mean? What does that look like? And so here's an example of a room clear.
I'm sick of you and I'm sick of your face.
There's the peak behavior, throwing things. She just signals the class. They practiced this before. They know where to go. The other teacher next door grabs them. No biggie. I mean, it is a biggie, peak behavior, but the actual room clear is pretty quick and the student can be in there without being in danger to others because everybody is kept safe. Be sure, as you've heard me say, the pitfall here is accidentally reinforcing the behavior that we're trying to help our students avoid. So be sure you know the function, and that's why we ideally wouldn't want to send the student out if they're trying to avoid something in the room like the work, because then they would just engage in that peak behavior more in the future. Once they get through the peak behavior, keeping in mind that peak behavior takes a lot of energy and therefore it doesn't last very long. It's usually pretty quick. It's over real fast because of the amount of energy that the student has to extend in order to throw things, flip the desk, be aggressive, yell. That's exhausting. So peak behavior is pretty short. And then we go into de-escalation. As soon as they kind of have that breath after the peak behavior, they're maybe disoriented. They may not even realize what they did or didn't know the severity of what they did because it happened so fast. So they may even be in denial that it occurred. They may be eager to please or make amends. And they're saying, I'm so sorry. Well, let me go. And you're trying to keep teaching. So you may not be able to interact with them one-on-one. And at this stage, you wouldn't want to necessarily. The student themselves is going to avoid interacting with others and probably even you as the teacher because they're embarrassed. They realize with that step back what they just did. So our focus here is on just monitoring so that we don't re-escalate. We don't want to re-trigger anything. And we do want to try our best to help the student move forward in a constructive manner. But part of that probably just means leaving them alone, doing nothing, giving them a place to cool down quietly, independently, if possible, in a safe place in the room. Maybe there's someplace in the school where they're able to go, but ideally in the classroom because we don't want to reinforce the escape moving out of the room. So just giving them some time like over here. And it could be give them some busy work, something easy to do because they're going to want to engage in something, but not something that's going to be challenging or that could be a trigger again. So if it's a simple worksheet, some busy work, they're going to be eager to do that, or a simple task or something that they can do in the classroom. That makes them feel a little better because they're embarrassed that they did what they just did, and they're feeling a little bit productive, but independently, not with others, not with you, the teacher. Keep an eye out for re-escalating anything. Make sure everybody's staying safe if the students have returned from a room clear and that they're able to engage in their work until our target student is able and ready to rejoin the group. And that may take a while. The de-escalation, depending on the student, can be quick or can be minutes. It could be the next day. Hopefully not, because we want to re-engage them with the learning as soon as possible. This is not the time to have a conversation about what they did wrong, what to do better next time. We're not doing that here. This is leave them alone and allow them to de-escalate on their own. They will be very successful doing that if they're left alone. Then we can head into the recovery. So they've had some time to de-escalate and to calm down. At the beginning of the recovery stage, we still don't want to debrief. It's still too soon. We want some time in between. So now they're ready to do some work, maybe ready to re-engage with the group, but on a subdued level, not fully engaging in like a debate team or something, but they could sit with the group and interact. They may not want to talk, but they could do some of the work. So a little bit of reluctance, a little bit of subdued, but they're willing to do some things. And maybe you continue to do independent work, but it's no longer busy work. It's back on the task with the class, just allowing them to work on their own so that they're able to stay a little removed because they may be feeling a little bit embarrassed still. And again, we don't want to talk about it probably, certainly not right away, because they're going to most likely be defensive. So we want to wait in the recovery, at the very, very end of the recovery, almost really in calm. Sometimes even the end of the day after school or lunchtime is maybe when we would engage in the debrief. But here are strategies as we're entering into recovery, help them transition to some normal activities, maybe independently, later debriefing, being reinforcing of anything that they are doing well in a way that's not re-triggering, because if your words at all are the trigger today, then maybe it's a praise note or a nonverbal behavior signal, maybe a thumbs up or something to acknowledge that they're back on task and they're engaging in appropriate behavior. Later, we're going to debrief and maybe rehearse problem solving. What could you have done to prevent this? Or when you notice the signs of agitation or even acceleration, what could you have done? What have we practiced? Let's practice again right now. And eventually you're going to get to that debriefing session. And many people are familiar with this. We're going to help that student get back onto task and know what to do next time to get back to the task quickly, whatever it might be, without not furthering any consequences here, but just help them get back to work. And we want to increase future appropriate behavior, of course. This is a problem solving. We can engage with the student in discussion for problem solving. Sometimes there's activities that they fill out independently. When they're in the calm phase again, we could be teaching the replacement behaviors, but we could decide what they are, talk with them if we need to figure out what that is. This could be a good point for them to tell you what was the trigger that led to that full acceleration to the peak behavior. And some pitfalls that we want to avoid from the debriefing session, and even before for the whole recovery phase, rather, we want to make sure that we're following through on consequences, whatever they were. We don't ever make empty threats. We say that this is going to happen, or they know because it's a standard consequence. When this happens, when you throw a book bag across the room, this is the consequence. When you say something to a teacher in a certain way, however it's defined for defiance or whatever, this is the consequence. And that way it's expected. It's not just the teacher's feelings and reactions that are assigning the consequence, because that could make the student feel that there's some favoritism going on here. So I've got a non-example of a debrief session here that might be helpful. This is with Dr. Terry Scott here at U of L, What Not to Do. And I need to turn on the video and audio, so just a second here.
When Cindy is not aware of the consequences.
The way you handled yourself in the hall was completely unacceptable.
Whatever.
Well, I'm thinking this. Based upon the way you acted, I'm thinking 3 days of suspension.
What? 3 days? What did I ever do to you?
3 days seems right to me.
God, I'm sick of you.
So because it wasn't the standard consequence and it was very clearly the whim of the teacher based on the behavior, that just re-escalated the behavior right there. So let's see Dr. Scott do a better job this time.
Hi, Cindy. I know you were really angry in the hall earlier, but you think maybe there's a better way you could have handled that?
I guess so.
Yeah. You know, you and I have talked about this before, so you know that when you throw a backpack or yell at a teacher, it's 3 days of suspension.
3 days?
Yeah.
That's a lot. My parents are going to be so pissed.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. That's the way it is. You know, we all lose our emotions sometimes, and you did this morning, I do sometimes, and I tell you what, when you come back to school, maybe you and I could work on this and help each other with keeping those emotions in check, right? Okay.
So a lot more of what we wanted to see there is continuing to show empathy using a standard consequence so there's no surprises, and being respectful to the student during the debrief, making a plan for what to do moving forward strongly to prevent the challenging behavior in the future. So those are the 7 phases of the acting out cycle, and you can, of course, go much more in depth by going through the module, sharing pieces with your faculty and staff. But one of the benefits within the module is this template for building a individualized de-escalation plan based on those 7 phases. And I've worked with a number of teachers who have used this template to have this intervention plan, really, to let all the adults who work with the student know, what does this student look like in each of these 7 phases? And what strategies work with this student when I notice those things? So I can look at the student, see what they're doing, and with my double-sided one piece of paper here, say, oh, those are signs of agitation. Here's what I can do that have worked before for this student. So you can work through this template and fill it in, working as a team to identify, with the family included, what are the triggers and what would work, what would help redirect the student, what would be a nice choice to have when agitation or acceleration is occurring. Also in the module, you'll get these 8 steps or 9 steps for how to create the individualized de-escalation plan, and it'll just walk you through it. So using your intervention grid to identify students who need it, working with the parents and families, who's on the team that's going to help build this, have that team meeting to figure out what the student looks like in each of the phases of the acting out cycle. Get their input before and after, social validity. What do you think of this plan? Ask the student, will this work? And if not, maybe there's some small changes that could be made that would work. Have some treatment integrity checklists. So the customized, individualized de-escalation plan is implemented as it was designed each time that it needs to be throughout the days. We can monitor that. Give opportunities for check for understanding to make sure everybody's, understanding what they're going to do. So don't just give them the sheet of paper and say, go do this, but walk through it, talk through it, practice, maybe role play, teach the student, of course, if you haven't already, like when you checked for their social validity, what they thought of it, and then implement it and collect data and make modifications as needed. And again, remember, there's this tier 3 grid in the module that you can use. You can add it to your Ci3T implementation manual and have it there with the links for learning more, as well as for collecting data to monitor the whole plan.
So in the next few minutes, we're going to cover another module that we've got on the Enhancing Ci3T website. It's all about supporting students with internalizing concerns at Tier 3. So as we get into this, let's talk a little bit about what internalizing concerns mean with respect to students. So when we talk about internalizing behaviors, we're typically talking about students that are shy, anxious, withdrawn, or have issues that are sort of like directed inward towards the self. They're often like over-controlled behaviors that can really interfere with how a student is able to perform at school and in their life as a whole. So it's important to keep in mind that we talk about internalizing behaviors because we often come from a more behavioral lens, but you certainly could conceptualize or think of these concerns as mental health challenges as well. So when you think about mental health and we think about internalizing behaviors, there's a high degree of overlap between those two ideas, just to kind of build some common language as we move forward in this part of the presentation. And the reason we should be concerned about students that have these types of concerns is that there are some real good data that suggests that even students that perform fairly well at school on the outer layer of their lives that constant stress that people are under from feeling very anxious or from being socially withdrawn can have pretty negative impacts in the long run. Students with higher levels of internalizing concerns, research has shown they tend to have lower levels of academic achievement. They might have problems with school adaptation, problem being engaged during school activities because, again, they're dealing with that stress or anxiety behind the scenes. There might be a higher risk of school dropout, being rejected by peers, or even dropping out of high school. And so we really want to think about how can we proactively support these students, because we would like to do some skill building to help students deal with these challenges before they kind of get the best of them and start to cause problems in their lives. Because frankly, a lot of students that have internalizing behaviors, they might appear to be doing well in terms of academics. And oftentimes they're not screaming to get our attention with their behavior, like the students that David was describing with the more large acting out behavior. But nevertheless, some of these quieter, more internal behaviors can be a cry for help. And we want to make sure that we're able to give them supports. So let's talk a little bit more about what kinds of internalizing concerns exist. So one type of internalizing challenge relates to anxiety. Anxiety is characterized by having negative thought patterns, excessive worries or fears, and some physical manifestations of those challenges, which could be like sweating, rapid heartbeat, trembling, crying, things like that. Another internalizing challenge is depression, which oftentimes comes with a loss of interest in activities, poor concentration, an overall feeling of sadness, high levels of fatigue, or even being irritable. Additionally, there's social withdrawal, which looks like pulling away from social activities or social interactions. It might look like a lack of interest in social activity, but sometimes students that struggle with social skills, they act like they don't want to be involved socially when really they're just struggling to feel efficacious in those environments. And then the last type of internalizing concern is called somatization, or you might call this making somatic complaints, which is when students frequently complain of physical pain that it's not based on an injury or an illness, but rather those overwhelming feelings of potentially anxiety or other challenges that end up making the student feel like they're in pain when really they're struggling with those emotions. Now, as we think about these different types of internalizing concerns, I'm going to zoom back out on this just so we can kind of put it back into context. These tend to happen together in many cases, so you wouldn't just have one or the other. These are sort of patterns that oftentimes co-occur with a single student, and they're things that we want to be aware of so we can identify them when they occur. Now, that said, in schools, we are not psychologists. And it's not our job to diagnose mental health problems. That falls pretty far outside of our purview. That said, it's a bit ironic that it's really not our job as teachers to be mental health clinicians, and yet most students who receive mental health services receive them through the school as their primary point of contact, because that's where the kids are. So we're in this kind of catch-22 situation where we need to be careful not to outpace our expertise in terms of identifying these problems, but we want to be aware of them so that we can help to say, hey, we need to get this student some assistance to address these concerns so that they can be more successful and prevent those negative outcomes. So at the very beginning of the presentation, David talked about screening a little bit. And one of the incredibly significant benefits of using a screening tool like the student risk screening scale for internalizing and externalizing behaviors is that you have a way to pick up on internalizing behaviors, even when they're a little bit slight, because even slight challenges can sometimes predict problems later on down the road. And because these kids aren't getting tons of office discipline referrals or knocking over desks and chairs in large expressions of anger or externalizing behaviors, they're not getting our attention unless we have some way to detect those challenges early on. So screening is a great way to say, oh, we should really pay attention to this concern. That's what screening is. What screening is not is it is not a diagnostic tool, and it doesn't necessarily even give us any specific information about what the internalizing challenge is. It just tells us that there might be one. So as you're looking at data or thinking about how we can support students that might have these internalizing problems, it's important, particularly as we get to the top of the pyramid, that we think about maybe potentially getting some additional data collected to help us figure out what's going on with the student, what kinds of challenges are they facing, and what can we do to support them. So what I'm showing you right now is a screenshot from this module that's called Supporting Students with Internalizing Concerns at Tier 3. Everything that I'm going to present to you in this section of the PowerPoint comes from this module. And what I love is it has this table in it that basically gives you some ideas for potential assessments that could be given to help get closer to identifying what kinds of internalizing concern a student might be facing, and then to action plan based on those data. So that's a great resource for you if you have students that you're concerned about, not because you're going to go out and buy them and use them, but rather it's a conversation starter with your school psychologists, with your school mental health team, with your school Ci3T leadership team. And eventually, potentially, as part of a collaborative conversation with parents to get some permission to have conversations with the child and potentially collect some additional data. So we're not going to collect any new data for anything related to these concerns unless we have some clear permissions given from parents or guardians to make sure that that's okay that we do this. And in addition to these kinds of assessments, having your school counselor or social worker having some conversations with parents too to get some extra context and information about what's going on, in this child's life that might be causing them concern. Because honestly, a lot of internalizing concerns for children, just like with adults, are coming from real life problems, traumas that, of course, these might actually cause some challenges at school. Things like deaths in the family, divorce, any number of things that are going on in the real world are going to be coming to school with our children. And so having greater context on what's happening with that child is really important. So the module gives some really good guidance for what kinds of conversations that might happen to get that insight, and then what additional data could be collected. Now, for Tier 2 supports for students with internalizing, there's a lot of options that you can use. That's not really the focus of our presentation tonight, because we're going to be really focusing on Tier 3. But I'm going to drop some hints about what kinds of Tier 2 supports you might use. And the reason is that sometimes there's a continuum between Tier 2 and Tier 3 that's pretty. I said continuum, so I can't say continuity. Basically, there's no clear distinction between a Tier 2 and a Tier 3 intervention sometimes, because you could start to take something for Tier 2 and intensify it, make it a little bit more personalized, a little bit more intense, maybe meeting more often with a student to talk through some of these strategies that we're going to be talking about during this section of the presentation. And eventually we kind of work our way up to Tier 3 if the need determines that's necessary. So, for example, you might have a counselor-led social skill instruction group that's going to teach students social and emotional skills related to understanding what anxious thoughts and feelings look like and feel like in the body, and teaching some strategies for how we can address those anxious thoughts and feelings in a constructive manner. That's something that's going to be called cognitive behavioral therapy, and we'll get to some discussion of what that means in a few slides. But you might do that for Tier 2. Where you have the counselor meeting with a few students that have data that suggests they might need a little bit of extra support a few times a week. And then as you're meeting with those students, you might be finding, some of these kids need a little bit of extra help. So you might add extra sessions per week that could kind of intensify that to a Tier 3 level. So I wanted to kind of lay out the groundwork for that, because there is kind of this continuum between Tier 2 and Tier 3 that's not always super clear, but just thinking about having some sort of way to make things more intense to meet those students' needs when our internalizing concerns become so great that we really need to make sure we're doing everything we can to push in those supports. And also on this slide, you're seeing counselor-led social skills groups as examples of Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. It's good to keep in mind that, especially as we get closer to the Tier 3 level, a lot of these interventions are going to be collaborative. They're going to be working with mental health care professionals, both within the school and potentially in community settings as well. So it's important to know that it's not your charge as a classroom teacher to go and address this issue all by yourself. But coming to a session like tonight can be really helpful, because then you start to build some of the vocabulary and concepts that could be used in these kinds of pull-out groups led by counselors or social workers or psychologists, so that you can try to bring some of that into the classroom. Because oftentimes, if you're going to therapy, it's in an office, you're in a one-on-one setting or a small group setting. You're talking about what you can do to address, these troubling emotions that you're feeling. But then you get out into the real world and you forget to use those strategies in the moment that you need them most. But as a classroom teacher, if we're prepared to prompt the students on those strategies and to have these conversations as well that connect to what's happening in those therapeutic settings, we stand to help students be much more successful in applying those skills in the real world. So I mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, and I want to just do a really brief primer on what we call CBT. I'll give a disclaimer that I am not a licensed mental health professional. I'm a special education professional. I'm sure a lot of you also are not licensed mental health professionals. So we're not showing you this to say, hey, here's what CBT is, go and do it. Rather, what we're saying is it's a really good idea to know what mental health professionals might be doing with students so that we can make those connections and provide some assistance in students applying those skills, as I mentioned earlier. So CBT is all about this thoughts, feelings, behavior triangle, where we're trying to understand the relationship between what we're thinking inside our heads, how that relates to how we feel, both about ourselves and about our circumstance, and how that drives how we act in the environment. And that our behaviors then loop all the way back around and impact how we're thinking. And it creates this cycle, this thoughts, feelings, behavior cycle. So the goal here is going to be to help students recognize potentially thoughts that might be not so helpful or not very productive, help them to maybe create new thoughts that could be more helpful, or strategies that we can use to maybe calm down or manage our emotions a little bit more effectively, and then how to be really purposeful about choosing the behaviors that we engage in to then give us more positive thoughts when possible. So that's the basic idea behind cognitive behavioral therapy. Some of the essential components of cognitive behavioral therapy are things like psychoeducation, cognitive restructuring, and collaboration with multiple people who are involved in that student's life. I'll go a little bit more into detail over the coming slides, but I do just want to say some of these might be new vocabulary. I think you'll hear them and be like, okay, that makes sense. But if you want to return to these resources, I really encourage you to check out the Supporting Students with Internalizing Concerns module, which I'll just highlight right here. We've got this cover featured right here to say, hey, this is the module where all these resources come from. So if you're looking at the PowerPoint tonight and you're like, man, I wish I could learn more about this, because I kind of have to hustle through some parts of this. This module is where you're going to find a trove of really helpful resources for you. Again, just for getting familiar with what these processes might look like. So let's dig into the first major component of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is psychoeducation. So psychoeducation is helping to learn about the nature of thoughts and feelings that we have often that can be associated potentially with mental health challenges or with internalizing behaviors. So for example, psychoeducation would be teaching someone, what does anxiety mean? What are some examples of anxious thoughts and feelings? What are some examples of some of the physical symptomology in our bodies that come with those anxious thoughts and feelings? And to identify when they're happening in our own bodies. So understanding that when I get anxious, maybe I get kind of sweaty, maybe my hands shake, or my I have to clear my throat a lot. It's important for us to start recognizing those things, because then we can normalize them. And that's another feature of psychotherapy, is helping us to feel like this isn't just something that happens to me. It's something that happens to many different people. It's a challenge that many different people face. And by normalizing those feelings, it can kind of take down some of the intensity that we feel these things, because we can say, okay, other people can relate to this problem. I can talk about this with other people and they're not going to think that I'm crazy. I can ask for help and people aren't going to think that I'm a loser or overly emotional. Like, this is something that a lot of people have. And it can also help us to recognize, sometimes physical symptoms of anxiety are really important to pay attention to. Like the fear response and the anxiety response are very similar. And sometimes we feel fear because we need to act to keep ourselves safe. And so as part of psychoeducation, we're going to be learning what are some helpful feelings around anxiety and what are some unhelpful feelings around anxiety? Do I have situations where I get anxious when, the trembling hands isn't really helping me to make new friends at school? So what can I do to address those thoughts and feelings that come with anxiety? And that leads me to the next major component of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is called cognitive restructuring. It's a very technical sounding idea, but I think can be pretty casually described as basically helping us to rethink about some of our own thought processes around maybe anxious thoughts or feelings, right? So you have to identify that some situations consistently make us anxious. And those anxious feelings come along with some specific thoughts, like the voice in our head is telling us, I need to avoid this situation. Maybe it's like public speaking. And those anxious thoughts and feelings are, I'm going to get up there. I'm going to forget everything that I'm going to say. I'm going to make a fool of myself and people will never forget it. Right. And so you can see like there's an escalating sense of panic that comes with each of those thoughts. And in reality, the fear of public speaking is normal. And generally, people don't really remember our public failures all that much. And it's just not something that we need to be so worked up about. So we have to say, okay, I need to recognize that those thoughts aren't really true. And they're certainly not helping me. And I have to say, when I experience those thoughts, what are some ways I can shift that pattern to something that's more helpful? So when I'm having this public speaking anxiety, I need to recognize, okay, I think I'm going to get up there and forget everything I said, but I practiced my speech last night 2 times in the mirror, and I practiced in front of my mom or my friends. So I've got it in there. And I just need to take deep breaths and remember that I'm good. I can do this. I don't need to worry. And if I make a mistake, people like me, they'll forgive me, and they probably won't even remember. Right. So it's a process of taking the bad thoughts and replacing them with good ones. And of course, not feeling guilty about having the bad thoughts, not labeling them as bad thoughts, but just understanding, hey, those are just these ideas that pop up sometimes. I want to replace them with more helpful ideas. So that's the cognitive restructuring technique. And then sometimes cognitive behavioral therapy will also include some other components, things like relaxation techniques. And I gave a little preview of that in the last slide. So relaxation techniques are things that we can do to help ourselves alleviate some of those feelings in our body that come with things like anxiety. These techniques are pretty widely known now. I think they probably appear in a lot of your school's social and emotional learning programs, or even things like Go Noodle have them built in sometimes. But there are things like breathing strategies, like belly breathing, which is where we breathe in real deep, kind of make our belly bigger, and then let it go, right? And the belly breathing is prompting us to really fill up the belly with a deep breath, and then to let it go. There's a bunch of different kind of breathing strategies, and you can pick ones that feel developmentally appropriate, whether they be cute or very structured, whatever you can do to kind of help teach some of those management strategies. There's also something called guided imagery, which has to do with imagining sort of like your happy place. And then when you're feeling super stressed, you can go to your happy place and you think about some of the sensory experiences that you might have there. It could be an imaginary place. It could be a place you've been on vacation. It could be a place in your house, some place where you feel safe, some place where you want to be, and where you can really focus on some of those sensory experiences. For me, it could be the beach, could be a mountaintop, depends on my mood. But if it's the beach, I'm closing my eyes. I can hear the waves crashing against the sand. I can smell the salty breeze. I can hear the birds, cawing in the background. And by having this little sensory experience in my mind, I can just kind of tamp down on some of those escalating anxious feelings. Another strategy is called progressive muscle relaxation, which is basically a process of tensing and relaxing our muscles. You can do it in a pretty casual fashion, and that can be kind of helpful. Clench your fists and relax them. Clench your fists and relax them. You can do the same with your legs. There are also really good protocols that you can go and find on the internet that are basically going to take you from head to toe through a whole routine of relaxation. And they work. Like, it's really very relaxing if you can finish those routines. And it's a great way to kind of take down those anxious thoughts and feelings. So The last one that I'll go through with great detail, or minimum some detail, because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that we can cover everything, is activity scheduling. Basically, activity scheduling is just saying, okay, there are activities we can do that make us feel better. Let's make sure that we do them. Because when we're feeling lousy, it's really easy to forget there are things that make us happy, and doing those happy things is sometimes the best line of defense for improving our overall mood. Things like having hobbies and exercise are so important just for being a happy, healthy person, and encouraging our students to do those activities and potentially even building in opportunities for them to do them during the school day could be super impactful. So if you've got students that are struggling with some mood related challenges, again, hopefully they're getting some serious tier 2 or tier 3 supports with a counselor or a social worker. But you could collaborate with those people and say, hey, let's come up with a list of school-based activities that we can get this kiddo doing that's going to make them feel good, whether they be social or exercise-based. And let's dedicate 10 to 15 minutes every single day to give this kid space and time to do those things. I would recommend they not be screen time based because they're getting a lot of screen time anyways. So it's not going to play a video game just because playing video games makes me feel good. It's something that we know is good and healthy for people to do, but also is going to get some of those endorphins moving for that student. So yeah, if we can figure out what those activities might be and make time for them to do that, it's going to be all the better. And honestly, my favorite thing about this is we want kids to like being at school. Sometimes kids with serious internalizing behaviors struggle feeling safe and calm at school. So if we can build in guaranteed opportunities for that kid to come and do something that's going to make them feel appreciated, safe, happy, and engaged, like we owe it to ourselves to make sure there's time in their day to do those things so that they like coming to school. So I think that's a really important piece. There are some additional strategies like systematic desensitization, which is basically if you have specific fears or things that make you feel anxious, very slowly trying to expose ourselves or our students to those things is a good strategy. A lot of research shows that this is effective, but I'll say you have to be really careful with desensitization techniques because you have to go slow. And as a classroom teacher, I'm not creating a desensitization plan for a student with tier 3 needs. I might be participating in one, so I would want to know what my role is, but it's not something that you would go and set up by yourself, because we want to be really careful because it can be stressful, somewhere between stressful and traumatic to people to be rushed through these things, right? So if you're terrified of public speaking and you just throw people up there to be in front of groups, we're setting them up for failure. Or I think about like kids that were a little bit afraid to go into the deep end as in early childhood, and then somebody throws them in the deep end and be like, swim. We've exposed them to this thing. All it does is just it traumatizes people. It increases phobias, right? So because we should be concerned that we could make things worse through this technique, we would want to be real careful with this. But it's good to know what it is so that you could participate if you were involved in someone's treatment or support plan that goes through school, to be involved. So that's kind of a crash course in some ideas that come with internalizing supports. We've got a bunch of additional resources on other supports that you can use, as well as data collection forms. We'll always be talking about collecting data on social validity, treatment integrity, and student outcomes as part of any plan to implement and monitor any sort of tiered intervention, and certainly tier 3 supports, and certainly supports for students with internalizing behaviors. If you're not familiar with those concepts of social validity, treatment integrity, and student outcomes, I can happily report to you that the module covers those in great detail. Pretty much all of the modules do. So that's a great place to go to find some more information on those topics, as well as the data collection forms that come with them. And then one final piece that I want to make sure that we cover is that we have to know that we can't be alone as educators in supporting students with these needs. It's simply too important to meet these needs in a comprehensive way. So one of the things we would encourage you to do is to check with your leadership teams, your Ci3T leadership team, your mental health team, and talk about what kinds of opportunities exist or could exist for making connections to community-based mental health providers. And then within that, making sure that we're doing things like linking our Ci3T plan to the supports that are being provided, because you guys are doing incredible things to support students, things that are really good and evidence-based practices to support students who have trauma-based needs or any sort of mental health need. Things like setting up really predictable school environments through the teaching of expectations, reinforcing expected behaviors through using behavior-specific praise and your ticket systems, increasing positive interactions between adults and students through behavior-specific praise. All of these things are like the building blocks of supports for students with these types of concerns. And you're even doing tier 1 instruction on social and emotional learning concepts like self-awareness and relationship skills. So it's important that for students that are getting these more intensive interventions, we communicate that to our mental health partners so that they know they're not starting from scratch and that they really should talk to us to figure out like, hey, what are our school expectations? How can we work that into our individual therapy sessions with this client? What kinds of skills are you guys talking about in your second step lessons or caring school community lessons or whatever you're using for your social and emotional learning component? Because as much as we can make that language connect across community health settings, home settings, and school settings, all the better. So that's a worthy thing to do. This module has resources that you can look at for ideas for making connections to community mental health providers. It's got resources you can use to, if you have good folks in your community doing this work, and you want to make that part of your tiered system so that tier 3 supports include community mental health or wraparound supports, which I'll talk about here in just a second. You can take these grids from the module and slot them into your implementation manual in the tier 3 grid section, and then make any modifications you need to make it relevant and applicable to your school setting. This is talking about wraparound supports, and the basic concept is, having a philosophy of supports that's all about connecting and building positive relationships across the settings that someone interacts with. So wraparound supports for students with internalizing concerns is really going to emphasize the student's home life, supporting the entire family to help them make sure that they have all the support that they need for the student, and then making those connections across all the settings. Wraparound supports also has a very strong research base for how to make that work. And you can also find resources to go deeper in that with the module, as I said. So it even includes things that I think could be overlooked, which is basically to say, as you're thinking about your school-wide plan, your Ci3T work, how could you create a flyer that you could go and give to your community mental health providers and say, hey, when you're working with students from our school district or from our school, we would really love for you to know that this system exists and talk to us about the specific components and ideas from within that system, because making those connections potentially could be so impactful for students.